Miran had never been to a place like this before. The transport shuttle moved silently across the frozen plain, its metal frame shaking with every gust of wind outside. He sat alone on the back seat, holding a small case with his tools. His assignment was simple, at least that was what the papers said. He was just a maintenance worker, someone called only when machines refused to follow the rules of their makers. Yet something in his heart told him this place was not like the others. The shuttle slowed and finally stopped. A large gate stood before him, covered in frost and glowing with dull lights. Soldiers guarded the entrance, their faces hidden under helmets. Without a word, they scanned his badge, checked his tools, and guided him through the gate. The air inside the walls felt heavy, as if it carried secrets no one was allowed to share. Miran followed the guard through long hallways that smelled of metal and chemicals. Every corner had cameras, every door had locks with flashing codes. It was clear that whatever was kept here was not meant to be seen by the outside world. The guard finally stopped at a narrow room and pointed inside. "This will be your station," the guard said without much interest. The room was small, only a desk, a bed, and a small screen on the wall. No windows. No sound of the outside world. Miran nodded and placed his case on the bed. He had lived in many stations before, but this one felt colder. Not because of the weather, but because of the silence. Even the people in the halls spoke in low voices, as if afraid that words themselves might break the rules. Later that day, Miran was given his first task. He had to repair a broken cooling unit in the lower sector. A soldier walked with him, never leaving his side. Miran found it strange. In most stations, guards did not care about workers like him. But here, every step was watched. As he worked, he noticed doors marked with red lines. They were guarded more heavily than the others. From behind one of those doors, he thought he heard a sound. Not the sound of machines, but something softer, like a voice. He paused for a moment, listening, but the soldier gave him a sharp look, and he quickly returned to his work. The sound stayed in his mind even after he finished the task. That evening, when the halls were quieter, Miran was sent again with supplies. This time, the path was deeper. He walked through a corridor lined with glass walls. Behind each wall were chambers filled with strange machines. Some held glowing liquids, others had shapes that looked almost alive. He tried not to stare too much. Workers were not supposed to ask questions here. At the end of the corridor stood a wide door with two guards. They scanned the supplies and opened the door just enough for him to enter. Inside was a large room, filled with strange lights. In the center was a chamber made of clear glass. Miran froze. Inside the chamber sat a girl. She was not human, yet there was something familiar about her. Her skin had a pale tone with a faint shimmer under the lights. Her hair fell softly around her face, and her eyes were large, glowing faintly as if holding a secret world within. She sat quietly on a simple seat, her gaze fixed on the glass wall. For a moment, Miran forgot himself. He had seen machines, weapons, even strange creatures during his years, but never someone who looked so close to human yet so different. She raised her head slightly when she noticed him. Their eyes met. Miran felt a chill run down his spine. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear, only a deep sadness mixed with curiosity. She did not speak, but her gaze held questions that words could not carry. A sharp voice broke the silence. "Do not look at her. Deliver the supplies and leave." Miran turned quickly. A scientist in a white coat stood near the corner, watching him closely. The man's face was stern, his eyes cold. Miran lowered his head, placed the supplies where he was told, and tried to leave without another glance. But he could not help it. As he walked out, he looked back one last time. The girl was still watching him. Slowly, almost carefully, she raised her hand and pressed it against the glass. It was a small gesture, but it struck him deeply. Back in his room, Miran could not rest. The image of her hand on the glass filled his mind. Who was she? Why was she kept there? And why were the rules so strict about not speaking or even looking at her? The next day, he tried to push the thought aside, focusing on his repairs and tasks. Yet each time he passed near the lower sector, he felt her presence. He began to notice little things. The guards grew more alert near her chamber. The scientists spoke in whispers when walking out of the room. Some carried files marked with warnings and symbols he had never seen before. Miran wanted to ask, but questions were dangerous here. Workers were expected to follow orders, not to wonder. Still, his mind refused to stay quiet. That night, when the lights dimmed and most of the station rested, Miran sat on his bed and thought about her. He remembered the sadness in her eyes, the silent way she reached out through the glass. She was not just a subject or a number in a file. She was alive. She understood. And though he had been told not to look at her, not to speak to her, he knew deep inside that rules could not stop the pull he felt. Something had started that day, something small yet powerful. Miran closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. The station was filled with secrets, but none seemed more important than the girl behind the glass. Miran's days in the station began to follow a quiet rhythm. He woke early, checked the machines, repaired what was broken, and carried supplies to the lower sectors. Yet no task, no matter how small, could erase the memory of the girl behind the glass. Every time he walked past her chamber, he felt her presence waiting, even when he told himself not to look. The guards had grown strict about the lower sectors. Workers were not allowed to linger near the glass walls. Cameras scanned every movement. Even a second of hesitation drew a glare from the patrolling soldiers. Miran followed the rules carefully, yet his curiosity kept tugging at him. He found small excuses to walk closer, just to catch a glimpse of her. She had a name, though no one outside the lab had called her by it. Miran learned it accidentally when a scientist muttered while passing, "Ari shows unusual awareness today." The word caught his attention. Ari. The name was soft, almost musical, and it made him feel more connected to her, even from a distance. Ari's routine was quiet and precise. She sat on her small seat, sometimes drawing shapes with her fingers in the air, sometimes pressing her hand to the glass. She did not speak, but her eyes watched everything around her. Miran began to notice small gestures, the way she tilted her head when a worker entered, or the way she followed the movement of machines with her gaze. One evening, Miran carried a cart of tools toward the lower sector. His heart thumped faster as he approached her chamber. Ari was sitting with her knees pulled close to her chest, staring at the floor. For a moment, she did not notice him. He placed the tools down carefully, keeping his back to the glass as the guard had instructed. Then, without warning, she lifted her head. Their eyes met. She tilted her head slightly, curious but cautious. Miran felt a strange warmth in his chest. She was watching him as closely as he was watching her. For a fleeting moment, the rules, the guards, the cameras, all of it seemed unimportant. The guards noticed nothing. They were focused on their patrol, their steps echoing in the corridor. Miran turned slowly and whispered, almost to himself, "Hello." The word was soft, barely audible, but Ari's head tilted further. She repeated it in her own soft voice, a tone that mimicked his almost exactly. It was the first sound he had heard from her, and it filled him with wonder. The world outside seemed to fade as he listened to the gentle sound of her voice. He knew he had to be careful. Speaking to her was forbidden. But the connection was too strong to ignore. Each evening, after his work was done, he found small ways to be near her chamber. He arranged his tools in places that allowed him to glance at her while appearing busy. Ari began to respond with gestures, a small wave of her hand, a tilt of her head, even drawings on scraps of paper she somehow received. Miran watched her patterns. She learned quickly. If he tapped on the glass lightly, she responded with a tap back. If he moved a tool slowly from left to right, she mimicked the motion in the air. Over time, they developed a silent language, a way to communicate without words. Miran realized that Ari understood more than the scientists gave her credit for. One night, as Miran returned from a long shift, he noticed Ari looking at him differently. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of caution and curiosity, but there was also something new: trust. She reached toward the glass, her small fingers pressing against it. Miran pressed his hand to match hers, feeling a strange connection despite the cold barrier between them. The sound of footsteps made him pull back quickly. A guard was passing by. Miran stepped aside, hiding the gesture, while Ari lowered her hand. Her eyes followed him, and he understood her message clearly: she was waiting for him to return. Miran began to notice subtle details about her. Her skin was pale but soft, almost glowing under the lab lights. Her hair moved gently as she shifted her position, and her eyes were full of thought and emotion. He realized she was intelligent, far beyond what the scientists admitted. They treated her like a subject, but she was a person, capable of learning, thinking, and feeling. The more Miran observed, the more he saw the loneliness in her. She had no one to talk to, no one to share her thoughts with, except him. He felt a growing responsibility toward her. He could not allow the scientists to continue treating her as an object. But he also knew the risks. A single mistake could endanger both of them. One afternoon, as he was repairing a small machine near her chamber, Ari held up a small drawing she had made on a piece of paper. It showed a tiny figure standing outside a wall, looking at a star. Miran understood immediately. She longed for freedom, for a world beyond the glass walls of the facility. His heart ached. He wanted to help her, but he did not know how. Days turned into weeks. Their silent observation became a routine. Miran studied her gestures, her expressions, her attempts to communicate. Ari began to mimic his movements more accurately. Sometimes, when he performed a small task, she would copy him exactly, as if learning to understand human behavior. It was astonishing to him. He realized that intelligence and empathy were not limited by species. Yet, the more he grew close to her, the more he felt the weight of the rules. Every time a guard glanced his way, every time a scientist walked past, he remembered the warning: do not speak to her, do not look at her too long. But Miran could not stop. Every night, he returned to her chamber, even if only for a few moments. Their silent connection was becoming stronger, deeper, and more meaningful. Miran began to wonder what the scientists were planning for her. He noticed files being carried in and out of the chamber, strange devices being tested, and machines that hummed with energy. Ari watched these actions with curiosity and concern. Miran understood that her life was not safe, and that knowledge only made him more determined. That night, after the station had gone quiet, Miran lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Ari, about her quiet courage and intelligence. He thought about the small ways they had begun to communicate. And he made a silent promise to himself: he would protect her, no matter the rules, no matter the danger. The bond between them was more powerful than fear, more powerful than rules, and he knew it would guide whatever came next. Miran's nights had begun to feel longer and heavier. Every sound in the station seemed louder, every shadow more alert, yet his thoughts always returned to Ari. He had watched her silently for weeks, learning her gestures, her habits, the small ways she communicated without words. Each glance, each movement, made him feel a growing connection he could not ignore. One evening, after a long shift repairing the cooling units in the lower sectors, Miran carried a small tray of tools to Ari's chamber. The station was quieter than usual. Guards were stationed at their usual points, but the corridors were empty of other workers. His heart beat faster than normal. He told himself this was just another delivery, another task. Yet, the moment he approached the glass, he saw Ari looking at him with something new in her eyes, a spark of anticipation. Miran paused, holding the tray carefully. Ari raised her hand slowly, a small wave. He froze, afraid that any sudden movement might draw attention from the cameras. Then, without thinking, he lowered the tray to the floor and whispered softly, "Hello." The sound was barely audible, carried only a few feet through the chamber. Ari's head tilted, and for a moment, she did not move. Then, softly, she repeated the word, "Hello." Miran's heart leapt. Her voice, quiet and delicate, carried more meaning than 1,000 gestures. He had spoken, and she had understood and responded. That simple exchange created a bridge between them, a small connection that defied the strict rules of the station. He tried to keep his voice low, but the moment had broken some invisible barrier. Ari pressed her palm to the glass. Miran hesitated, then did the same. Their hands almost touched, separated only by the cold, clear surface. He could feel the warmth of her gesture, the silent request to be acknowledged. From that night, their connection began to grow. Each evening, Miran found small ways to communicate. He tapped a rhythm on the glass, and Ari tapped back. He drew simple shapes on scraps of paper and slid them under the door to her chamber. She returned them with her own drawings, stars, strange creatures, landscapes he could not recognize but that seemed to belong to another world. Each night, the small exchanges strengthened their bond. Miran realized how intelligent she was. She did not just mimic his movements, she responded in ways that showed understanding and curiosity. Sometimes, she asked questions through her drawings or gestures. Sometimes, she tried to imitate human expressions. Miran found himself laughing softly when she tilted her head in confusion at something he had written, and his laughter seemed to reach her across the glass. But the station remained dangerous. Guards passed by at unpredictable times, and the scientists monitored every detail. Miran learned to be careful, to act as if he were busy with tools or machines, even when his attention was entirely on her. Yet, despite the risk, he felt it was worth it. Ari was no longer just a subject behind the glass. She was someone who understood him, someone who needed him. One night, while Miran was repairing a small generator near her chamber, he noticed a flicker in her eyes. She had drawn a small symbol on a piece of paper, one he had not seen before. It looked like two circles connected by a line. He tapped gently on the glass, pointing to the symbol. Ari smiled slightly, then tapped a reply, a single circle. Miran understood immediately. She was asking him to return the next night and continue their communication. He nodded silently, though she could not see it, and left the chamber carefully. In his room, he studied the symbol. It was simple, yet it carried meaning. They had begun creating a language of their own, a way to communicate beyond words, beyond the rules of the station. Each small interaction became a test of patience, intelligence, and trust. As the days passed, their bond deepened. Ari began to respond to more complex gestures. If Miran moved a small object in a pattern, she would replicate it with her fingers in the air. If he arranged tools in a shape, she would try to draw it on her paper. It was as if they were speaking through actions and symbols, a conversation that only the two of them could understand. Miran also noticed her emotions more clearly. She expressed joy when he returned with a new tool or paper. She showed frustration when a guard blocked her view or when the lights dimmed too early. She even seemed to understand subtle humor, tilting her head and making small gestures that made him smile. In her eyes, he saw intelligence and awareness far beyond what the scientists claimed. One evening, after weeks of silent connection, Miran finally took a risk. He whispered a full sentence, careful to keep it low, "Do you want to leave this place someday?" Ari's eyes widened. For a moment, she did not respond. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and traced a line across the glass, from the floor to the ceiling. It was a simple gesture, but Miran understood immediately. She wanted freedom. She wanted to see the world beyond the walls of her chamber. The realization struck him with both hope and fear. He could not promise her freedom, but he could promise that he would try to protect her. The thought of helping her escape, of defying the strict rules of the station, filled him with courage he had never known before. Miran also began to understand that their connection was more than communication. It was trust. Ari trusted him, despite the unknown dangers around them. She believed that he would not harm her and that he could help her navigate the world outside. And in return, Miran trusted her intelligence, her awareness, and her courage. Each night, they continued their secret conversations. Every gesture, every drawing, every soft word brought them closer. Miran felt that he was learning as much from her as she was learning from him. In her presence, he felt alive in a way he had never experienced. He realized that their bond was a powerful force, capable of breaking through rules, walls, and fear. By the end of the week, Miran's routine had changed completely. Work became secondary to the moments he could spend near Ari. He began planning ways to make those moments longer, to create opportunities to teach her, to learn from her, and to strengthen their connection. Every day, he observed her more carefully, noting her habits, her preferences, and the small ways she expressed herself. Miran knew the danger. The scientists were watching, the guards were alert, and the rules were strict. Yet, he could not stop. Ari was no longer just a subject. She was a being with thoughts, feelings, and dreams. And for the first time, he understood that true human strength was not in following rules blindly but in acting with compassion and courage. That night, as he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, he thought of Ari and their first words. The word hello had changed everything. It had opened a door to trust, understanding, and hope. And he knew that their connection was only the beginning of a story that could change both of their lives forever. Miran's routine had changed completely since he first spoke to Ari. Each day, he looked forward to their secret moments, the small gestures, and whispered words that no one else could hear. But along with the joy of connection, he began to notice things that worried him deeply. The scientists were always observing, their eyes sharp, their movements calculated. There were files, machines, and notes he did not understand, all connected to Ari. Slowly, he began to realize that she was part of something far more serious than he had imagined. One evening, Miran was called to assist a scientist with a repair in the same sector as Ari's chamber. He carried his tools carefully, pretending that his visit was routine. But his curiosity drew him closer to the glass. Ari was there, sitting quietly, her hand on the glass as if waiting for him. She smiled softly when she saw him, a small expression of trust and relief. Miran returned the smile, though his mind was heavy with questions. The scientist did not notice him glancing toward the chamber. He was focused on a strange device that hummed softly, its lights pulsing in a rhythm that made Miran uneasy. As he handed a tool to the man, he accidentally dropped a small piece of paper that fluttered to the floor. Miran bent to pick it up and realized it had numbers, notes, and sketches he could not understand. At the bottom, in small letters, was a name, Ari. The piece of paper revealed something Miran had not known. Ari was not just an observer or a simple subject. She had been part of experiments, tests designed to measure her intelligence, her reactions, and her ability to adapt. The scientists did not treat her as a person. She was data. Every movement she made, every reaction, every sound was being recorded, analyzed, and stored. Miran's heart tightened. Ari was more than a subject. She was alive, aware, and capable of thought and emotion. And yet, the people around her saw only numbers, graphs, and results. He wondered what had happened before she arrived at the station, what experiences had brought her to this cold place. His mind filled with questions, but he knew that asking them aloud could put both of them in danger. That night, when Miran returned to his room, he could not sleep. The image of Ari, quietly waiting in her chamber, her eyes filled with trust, weighed heavily on his mind. He realized that he could no longer ignore the truth. She needed him, not just for companionship, but for protection. He had to understand the full scope of the experiments to know how to help her. Over the next few days, he observed the scientists more closely. He noticed the way they carried files to and from Ari's chamber, the small devices attached to the walls, and the strange monitors that measured her movements and responses. He began to understand that the experiments were designed to study how a being from another world could interact with humans. Ari's intelligence and emotions were being tested, her ability to trust, her responses to isolation and stimuli. Miran felt anger rise inside him. How could people treat a living being like a machine? How could they ignore her thoughts, her feelings, her need for freedom? He knew that if he did nothing, Ari's life would remain controlled, limited, and full of suffering. And yet, he also understood the risks. One wrong step could bring punishment, not just to him, but to Ari. One evening, as he delivered tools to her chamber, he whispered her name softly, Ari. She turned quickly, her eyes wide and attentive. He knelt near the glass and held up the piece of paper he had found. She studied it, her eyes moving over the sketches, the numbers, and the symbols. Then she pressed her hand to the glass and looked at him with an expression full of meaning. She understood that he had seen the truth. Miran nodded slightly, careful to keep his voice low. I know, he whispered. I know what they are doing to you. Ari's eyes widened. For the first time, he saw a flicker of fear mixed with relief. She had never spoken the truth aloud, had never shown the depth of her understanding to anyone. Yet here, in his presence, she revealed it all without words. She was counting on him to understand, to act, and to protect her. From that night, their connection grew stronger. They began to communicate more openly, using gestures, symbols, and soft words. Ari would show him her sketches, drawings of places she imagined, scenes of a world beyond the glass walls. She wanted him to see her dreams, her hope, and her desire for freedom. Miran promised himself that he would help her, no matter the difficulty. He also learned more about her intelligence. Ari began to solve small puzzles he created, showing remarkable understanding and memory. She could imitate human movements accurately, and she even began to anticipate his gestures. It was clear that the experiments had underestimated her abilities. She was learning, adapting, and thinking beyond the limits the scientists had set. One day, Miran found a small hidden panel near her chamber. Inside were more files, notes, and data recordings. He realized that the experiments were not just for observation. They were testing how far she could be pushed, how much she could endure, and how humans would react to her presence. Every day, Ari's life was carefully monitored, controlled, and restricted. Miran's determination grew. He could no longer pretend that he was just a worker. Ari needed him to be more than that. She needed him to be her protector, her ally, and eventually, her escape. He began to plan in secret, thinking of ways to shield her from the scientists, to create moments of safety, and to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. At night, as the station grew quiet, Miran would sit near his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Ari. He remembered her eyes, the way she had reached for him, the small gestures that had created a bridge between them. He realized that the bond they shared was stronger than the rules, stronger than the fear, and stronger than the cold walls of the station. He knew that understanding her situation was only the first step. The next step would be far more dangerous. He would have to act, to make choices that could change everything. But for the first time, he felt ready. He had learned the truth, and with that knowledge came courage. Ari was not just a subject of an experiment. She was alive, intelligent, and capable of trust. And Miran knew, deep in his heart, that he could not turn away. Whatever came next, he would stand by her, because their connection had become more than curiosity. It had become purpose, hope, and the beginning of a plan that could change both their lives forever. Miran could not stop thinking about Ari. Every moment he spent near her chamber, every glance, every gesture, reminded him of the risk he was taking. The station was filled with rules, cameras, and guards, yet he felt that the connection between them was more important than the dangers around him. He had discovered the truth about the experiments, and now he faced a choice: to act or to remain silent. The thought weighed heavily on him. If he did nothing, Ari would continue to live as a subject, her every movement controlled and analyzed. Her freedom, her hopes, her dreams would remain trapped behind the glass walls. But if he tried to act, if he tried to help her, the consequences could be severe. He could be punished, removed from the station, or worse. Yet, despite the fear, he felt a strange courage rising inside him. He could not turn away from her. That evening, as Miran carried a tray of tools to Ari's chamber, he noticed her waiting by the glass. Her eyes met his immediately, full of trust and hope. She had learned to recognize his steps, the way he moved, the small sounds he made. She raised her hand in greeting, and Miran pressed his palm against the glass in return. For a moment, the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them in silent understanding. He whispered softly, Careful not to be overheard, we need to find a way. Ari tilted her head, her eyes wide and curious. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she sensed his determination. He had made a decision. He could not let the scientists continue to control her life. Over the next few days, Miran began to plan in secret. He studied the patrols, noting when guards changed shifts and when cameras rotated. He watched the scientists closely, learning their routines, their habits, and the times when they were distracted. Every detail mattered. Every movement could be a chance or a risk. He also prepared small tools and supplies. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be traced. Just small things that might help them move, hide, or create distractions if necessary. He hid them carefully in areas the guards would not check, in corners of the lower sectors where he often worked. Each preparation felt like a silent promise to Ari, a way to show her that he would not abandon her. One night, while Miran was making these preparations, Ari pressed her hand against the glass. He approached slowly, kneeling near her chamber. She pointed to a corner of her room where she had drawn something on a small sheet of paper. It was a map of the chamber, with lines indicating exits and areas where the cameras were. Miran understood immediately. She was trying to help him, showing him what she had noticed, what she had learned while observing the room. The realization filled him with both hope and concern. Ari was intelligent, far beyond what the scientists had admitted. She could understand his plans, anticipate movements, and assist him in ways he had not expected. Yet, that intelligence also made the risk greater. If they were discovered, the punishment would be harsher because they had planned together. Miran spent the following days refining his plan. He could not act hastily. He had to wait for the right moment, when the patrols were light and the scientists were distracted. He studied every detail, memorized the shifts, and prepared for contingencies. Every day he communicated with Ari through gestures and drawings, ensuring that she understood what was coming, preparing her for the moment when action might be necessary. Despite the careful planning, fear remained. He could not ignore the possibility of failure, of capture, of harm to Ari or himself. Every step he considered was weighed against the risk. Yet, he also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. The bond they shared, the trust they had built, demanded that he act. One evening, after a long day of work, Miran approached Ari's chamber and whispered, "Tomorrow, we try." Ari's eyes widened, and she pressed her hand to the glass. He nodded, giving her a reassuring look. She understood. She was ready. Together, they would take the first step toward freedom. That night, as he lay in his bed, Miran could not sleep. He thought of Ari, of her eyes, her gestures, and the silent way she had communicated with him. He imagined the moment they would move together, the corridors they would pass, the guards they would avoid. Fear mixed with determination, anxiety mixed with hope. He knew that the next day would change everything. When morning came, Miran rose early. He moved quietly through the station, carrying only the necessary tools and supplies. The patrols were lighter than usual, the scientists absorbed in their work. Every step he took was careful, deliberate, measured. He approached Ari's chamber and saw her waiting, her eyes alert, her posture ready. He whispered softly, "We move now." Ari's hand pressed to the glass, and Miran mirrored the gesture. It was a moment of understanding, a silent agreement that they were ready to take the risk together. He carefully unlocked the door to her chamber, using a small code he had memorized from observing the security system. The door opened with a soft click. Ari stepped out slowly, her eyes scanning the corridor. She moved with caution, yet there was a confidence in her steps. Miran guided her toward the first corner, away from the cameras, toward the area he had planned as the safest path. Every movement was tense, every step filled with risk, yet they moved as one. As they passed through the first section of the lower sector, Miran whispered directions, and Ari responded with small gestures. She had learned quickly, adapting to his instructions, anticipating obstacles, and helping him navigate. The connection between them, built over weeks of silent observation and whispered words, proved invaluable. By the time they reached the next corridor, Miran realized how far they had come. They had moved together, carefully and quietly, without drawing attention. Each small success strengthened his resolve. He knew that the journey ahead would be more dangerous, more uncertain, yet he also knew that they had taken the first step. Standing in the dimly lit corridor, Miran looked at Ari and whispered, "We are ready." She nodded, her eyes reflecting trust, courage, and a silent promise. Together, they faced the uncertainty of the station, the rules that had controlled her life, and the dangers that awaited them. For the first time, Miran felt that he was not just a worker following orders. He was a protector, a friend, and a guide. Ari was not just a subject of experiments. She was a being capable of thought, emotion, and hope. And together, they had made a choice, a dangerous choice, but one that could lead to freedom, trust, and a future beyond the walls that had held her captive. The night was dark and quiet, but Miran's heart raced with tension and hope. Weeks of planning had led to this moment. Every step, every observation, every secret gesture with Ari had prepared them for what was about to happen. The lower sector was almost empty. Most guards were stationed in distant corridors, and the cameras were in positions that Miran had memorized. Now, they had to move carefully and quickly. Miran approached Ari's chamber. She was waiting by the glass wall, her eyes wide with anticipation and trust. He held a small set of tools in his hands, ones that would allow him to unlock the chamber quietly. He whispered softly, "We move now." Ari pressed her hand to the glass and then stepped back. Miran opened the door slowly, and Ari slipped out behind him. The corridor was cold and dimly lit. Every sound echoed, yet neither of them spoke aloud. They had learned to communicate through gestures, whispers, and small signals. Miran led the way, pointing to corners, signaling when to stop, and guiding her past obstacles. Ari followed, her movements careful and precise, showing the intelligence and adaptability that had impressed him since the first day. The first challenge came quickly. A small patrol turned the corner unexpectedly. Miran froze, pressing Ari gently against the wall. They waited silently, hearts pounding. The guards passed by without noticing them. Ari's eyes shone with relief and gratitude. Miran nodded toward her, a silent message, "Keep moving." They continued, each step bringing them closer to the exit they had planned. As they moved deeper into the lower sector, Miran noticed sensors on the floor and walls. These were devices he had seen before but never fully studied. They triggered alarms when pressure or motion was detected. Miran led Ari carefully around them, hopping over a few panels, crouching under others. Ari learned quickly, following his instructions without hesitation. Her intelligence and calmness under pressure amazed him. They reached the area closest to the main exit. The final doors were heavily secured, with codes and locks that Miran had memorized from his observations. He knelt by the control panel, working with steady hands. Sweat ran down his forehead as he inserted the small tool that would disable the locks temporarily. Each second felt like a minute. Ari watched silently, her eyes filled with trust and hope. Finally, the locks clicked. Miran signaled for Ari to follow him. She stepped forward, and together they moved through the heavy doors. The hall beyond was wider, leading toward the outer gates of the station. Their steps were careful, yet they were filled with determination. Freedom was near, and every movement brought them closer. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared. A camera had detected a small motion, or perhaps a guard had seen them in passing. Miran's heart jumped. He grabbed Ari's hand, pulling her into a small alcove beside the corridor. The alarm continued to echo through the walls. Guards rushed down the corridors, their footsteps loud and fast. Miran held Ari close, whispering, "Stay calm. We can do this." She nodded, her face showing both fear and courage. They waited, listening to the approaching guards. When the footsteps passed without finding them, Miran led Ari out again. Their movements were faster now, more urgent, but they stayed careful. Every shadow, every corner, every panel mattered. They reached a staircase that led upward, toward the outer gate. The metal steps creaked slightly under their weight, but Ari was careful to mimic his steps, moving in rhythm with him. The exit was just ahead, a heavy door that opened to a cold, empty landing outside the station. Miran inserted the final tool into the lock. It clicked open. The door swung slightly, revealing the world beyond the station silent, dark, and vast. Miran took a deep breath and led Ari outside. The cold air hit them immediately, sharp and biting. The sky was dark, filled with distant stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. Ari looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. For the first time, she had stepped beyond the walls that had kept her captive. She whispered a soft sound, one that Miran could not understand, but it was full of awe and relief. They began moving across the landing, careful to avoid the patrols. Miran had memorized a path that would lead them to a service tunnel outside the main gates. Ari followed closely, her trust in him complete. Every step was filled with tension, but also hope. They were almost free, almost beyond the reach of the scientists and guards who had controlled her life. Suddenly, a guard appeared at the far end of the landing, shouting and pointing. Miran reacted quickly, ducking behind a panel and pulling Ari down beside him. The guard fired a signal flare, lighting up the area with bright red light. They were exposed, yet Miran did not panic. He had prepared for this possibility. He grabbed a small device from his pocket, one that could create a temporary distraction by emitting a loud noise in the opposite direction. He activated it. A loud clang echoed through the corridor, drawing the guard's attention. The guard ran toward the sound, leaving the immediate path clear. Miran and Ari moved quickly, sprinting toward the service tunnel. The cold wind whipped against their faces as they ran. Every step brought them closer to safety. They entered the tunnel, narrow and dark, but safe from the patrols. Miran led Ari through the twists and turns, his memory guiding them. She followed silently, moving with the grace and awareness that had amazed him for weeks. For the first time, Miran felt that their planning had paid off. They were working as a team, relying on trust, intelligence, and courage. Finally, they reached the exit of the tunnel, a hidden door that led to a small clearing outside the station's perimeter. Miran opened it carefully. The world outside stretched before them, empty and silent, yet full of possibilities. Ari stepped out first, looking around with wonder and cautious joy. Miran followed, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. They had made it this far, together. For a moment, they stood in silence, catching their breath. The alarms inside the station continued to echo faintly, but they were far enough away to be safe for now. Ari looked at Miran, her eyes full of gratitude and trust. Miran nodded, a small smile crossing his face. They had taken the first step toward freedom, and nothing could take away the courage that had brought them here. Miran knew that their journey was not over. The station would send guards, they would be pursued, and the scientists would try to regain control. Yet, for the first time, he felt that they had a chance. Together, he and Ari had acted, taken a risk, and created a path toward freedom. The connection they had built, the trust and understanding, had carried them through the greatest challenge so far. As they moved away from the station, Miran whispered, "We are free for now. But we must keep moving." Ari nodded, her eyes shining with determination and hope. They walked into the darkness, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Their escape had begun, but the true journey was just starting. The clearing outside the station was cold and silent. Miran and Ari stood together, their breaths visible in the crisp air. The station loomed behind them, a dark structure filled with rules, cameras, and guards, yet now it seemed smaller, less powerful. They had escaped the immediate danger, but freedom was not yet complete. The world outside was vast and unknown, and every step forward carried risk. Miran looked at Ari. Her eyes were wide, full of wonder and trust. She had stepped out of confinement for the first time, leaving behind the walls that had controlled her life. Her movements were careful but confident, showing both her intelligence and courage. Miran felt a sense of pride mixed with responsibility. He had brought her this far, but now the real challenge began. "We need to move," Miran whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. "The station will send guards, and they will look for us." Ari nodded silently. She had learned to understand his words, gestures, and even the tone of his voice. Over the weeks of secret communication and careful observation, they had built a language of trust. She followed him as he led the way across the clearing, keeping close to shadows and low ridges that would hide them from view. As they moved through the dark landscape, Miran thought about the choices ahead. The station had tried to control Ari's life, to study her as if she were a machine. But she was not a machine. She was intelligent, aware, and capable of thought and emotion. He realized that the human choice was not about following rules, it was about doing what was right. And the right choice was clear: he had to protect her, guide her, and ensure that she could live freely. The first challenge came quickly. A patrol vehicle from the station moved through the distant valley, its lights sweeping the terrain. Miran pressed Ari down behind a ridge, keeping low. They waited silently, hearts pounding, as the vehicle passed without noticing them. Ari's hand brushed against his, a small gesture of reassurance. Miran squeezed it lightly in return. They were partners now, relying on trust and cooperation to navigate the danger around them. Once the patrol was gone, Miran led Ari toward a narrow canyon he had memorized from his briefings. It would provide cover and a hidden path away from the main station. The terrain was rough and uneven, but Ari moved carefully, her steps precise and aware. She had learned quickly, observing his movements, following instructions, and anticipating obstacles. The intelligence that had been tested inside the station now became their greatest advantage. Along the way, they discussed plans silently. Miran sketched simple maps in the dirt, showing safe paths, water sources, and areas where they could rest. Ari responded with her own gestures, pointing to features in the landscape that she noticed. Their silent communication had become almost seamless, a combination of trust, intelligence, and courage. It was clear that they were not only surviving, they were learning from each other. Hours passed as they moved through the canyon. The cold air and the rough terrain tested their endurance, yet they pressed on. Miran felt a deep sense of purpose. Every step was a choice, a decision to protect Ari and ensure her freedom. He understood that the human choice was not easy, but it was necessary. To act with courage, compassion, and responsibility was what separated humans from machines, and he intended to live by that principle. Eventually, they reached a small plateau overlooking a distant forest. The trees provided cover, a place where they could rest without being seen. Miran allowed Ari to sit and catch her breath while he surveyed the area. The stars above were bright, filling the sky with silent light. Ari looked up as well, her eyes reflecting awe and wonder. For the first time, she felt a world beyond the walls of the station, a place where she could choose her own path. Miran sat beside her. "We have made it this far," he said softly. "But the journey is not over. We must keep moving until we are truly safe." Ari nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She understood the words not just with her mind but with her heart. They were free from immediate danger, but freedom was not only a matter of escape, it was a matter of choice, courage, and resilience. As they rested, Miran thought about the future. The station would not give up easily. The scientists would send more guards, more patrols, and perhaps even trackers. Yet he knew that Ari's intelligence, adaptability, and trust in him gave them a chance. They would rely on their knowledge, their bond, and their careful planning to stay ahead. The human choice, he realized, was to act with wisdom and courage, even when the odds seemed impossible. After a brief rest, they continued moving through the forest. The trees provided cover, and the uneven ground slowed any potential pursuit. Ari moved with confidence, her awareness of the environment sharpened by weeks of observation inside the station. She had learned from Miran, yet she also contributed her own insights, showing initiative and understanding. Together, they were a team, navigating a world that was both dangerous and full of possibility. As night turned toward dawn, they reached a river. The water was cold, but it provided a path that would lead them away from the station's territory. Miran and Ari moved carefully along the bank, avoiding open areas and staying close to shadows. The journey was exhausting, yet their spirits were lifted by the realization that they were moving toward true freedom. At a bend in the river, Miran stopped and looked at Ari. "We are almost safe," he said. "From here, we can find a place to rest, a place to plan our next steps." Ari's eyes shone with gratitude. She pressed her hand to his in a silent gesture of trust. Miran squeezed it gently. Their bond had been tested, strengthened, and proven through courage, intelligence, and mutual respect. For the first time since leaving the station, Miran allowed himself to feel hope. The human choice, he realized, was not only about acting against injustice. It was about protecting those who could not protect themselves, about using intelligence, courage, and compassion to create a better future. And in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. They continued moving along the river until the sun began to rise. Light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The world seemed vast and endless, yet full of opportunity. Ari looked up at the rising sun, her expression filled with wonder and joy. She was free, not only from the walls of the station but from the control that had shaped her life. Miran walked beside her, thinking of the journey ahead. There would be challenges, and the station might continue to pursue them. Yet he knew that together, they could face anything. Ari's intelligence, adaptability, and trust, combined with his courage and determination, created a bond that no rules, walls, or danger could break. As they disappeared into the forest, Miran whispered softly, "We choose our own path now. Together." Ari nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding, hope, and a quiet joy. For the first time, they were truly free, guided by trust, courage, and the human choice to act with wisdom and compassion. The station was behind them, a memory of confinement and control. Ahead lay a future full of possibility, a world where freedom, understanding, and trust could guide every step. Miran and Ari had taken the first step, and now, side by side, they would walk a path of hope, courage, and the power of choice.